Welcome to the Eye of the Needle podcast, where we discuss healthcare innovation and explore how visionary entrepreneurs and change leaders are reshaping the future of our industry.
Hello, I'm Pam Arlotto, and welcome to this episode of the Eye of the Needle podcast. Today, I am joined by my good friend, Mark Pierce. And Mark, I'm going to let you introduce yourself.
Oh, fantastic. I appreciate that. Good to see you again, Pam. So as you mentioned, my name is Mark Pierce. By medical training, I'm a med-peds physician, and I practice at Parkview Health in Northeast Indiana. Been here about 25 years in what was a planned 5-year stopover on my career, but have been able to be a part of Parkview IT leadership for the past 20 years. And have seen a lot in my day in Parkview come and go, from the High-Tech Act to an EMR implementation system-wide to an analytics team that was built out to now the world of AI. So I feel like I've been around a little while here. And again, great to see you again.
Thank you. And so today we're going to talk about the evolving role of health informatics. And one of the conversations that I always hear from executives, from physician leaders, and from overall CMIOs, CNIOs, CHIOs, and a whole variety of other IOs is, what is the value of health informatics? And Mark and I are going to really tease that apart today and kind of peel the onion and dig under the hood and explore that. And one thing we both agree on is that the role is changing dramatically, has huge potential for value, but not all in the industry truly recognize it or embrace it. Is that fair, Mark?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely fair, Pam. Looking forward to getting into this.
Okay. So in my very first episode of the Eye of the Needle, I introduced a framework. And many of you know it as the 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and 4.0 framework. We have used that for over 15 years to talk about the changes the industry is going through and the different work and focus areas at each stage. And one of the things we've always agreed on is that each stage builds on the other. You can't really jump to 4 if you haven't done the work of 3 and 2 and certainly 1. So I'm going to just put a slide or two up here, Mark, and I'd like to get your reaction to that concept. So the journey to high value healthcare, and we're not going to go through this again. Like I said, if you're interested and want to dig into the framework itself, you can go to episode 1 of the Eye of the Needle podcast and see that. But Mark, what I'd like to explore with you today is the role of health informatics at each stage, and talk about some of the titles and some of the responsibilities that those leaders have at each stage, at 1.0 all the way through 4.0. And I also want to throw out a new premise that we may be stuck, many organizations may be stuck at 2.0, and what it's going to take to evolve past that. Is that okay with you?
Absolutely.
Great. Well, let's start with 1.0. And this is our old bricks and mortar healthcare. And many CMIOs first started their career in that role when they were known as the doctor in IT, and they reported to the CIO. And this was back in the meaningful use days. And they either had the role of cheering on adoption or policing those that didn't adopt it. You saw CMIOs, CNIOs. Sometimes you'd have somebody in lab that had an informatics function, sometimes a pharmacy person, but rarely were these leaders kind of aggregated or consolidated. They all kind of were in different parts of the organization. It's very much kind of an urgent in the moment. Whoever's screaming the loudest gets the attention of the informatics leader. They often didn't have any direct reports. They were kind of a lone gun or a lone wolf, if you will. And many people felt this role would go away once they had gotten their meaningful use incentives. So Does this sound familiar to you, Mark? And kind of what are your lessons learned from this stage in life?
Right. Well, you've described that quite well. And I do remember those days. It was as if the organization would borrow some political capital from physicians who had a good reputation. And as you mentioned, as some folks had some issues, behavioral issues, technical issues, and whatnot, go make that doctor happy so he doesn't ruffle too many feathers. And that doctor police moniker sort of resonates pretty well with me. And yeah, I think the idea from leadership at that time was that once the EMR was deployed and the dollars were recovered, that we'd kind of nestle back into practice and thank you for your time sort of thing. It does resonate quite well with the experience that a lot of us went through, especially around EMR activation as those threats of, well, no one's going to make me leave paper and I'm going to retire if this happens. That was sort of our wheelhouse, to be honest with you. And I think the organizations viewed us that way at the time.
Well, I know a lot of health informatics leaders at that point struggle because they felt that there was more they could do, and really optimizing the EHR became really important and the focus. In 2.0, we were trying to build out new capabilities. Class launched their Arch Collaborative so they could compare what was working across different sites. You saw some CMIOs begin to be more aligned with clinical leadership, either the CMO or the chief clinical officer. And they went beyond just getting people to use it to design it and optimizing the workflow. You saw also at this point, sometimes you'd see dotted line leadership. So someone might have a direct report to the CMO, but a dotted line to the CIO or vice versa. So a lot of matrix or even some dyad type models. We saw some CMIOs beginning to create an informatics strategy, beginning to pull in those nursing informatics individuals or some of the others that were in some of the ancillary or support areas. We also, at this point, began to roll out analytics capabilities. This was kind of the early stage of each organization wanting to have a more structured data analytics strategy. And not in every case, but in some cases, CMIOs began to play a role in that. And I think you did that. Am I correct?
Yeah, that was the experience at Parkview. And Pam, you've touched on a lot of interesting things to unpack with this 2.0 evolution of the CMIO. In this stage, this is still at that point where it's a leader without a ton of followers. And I think, as you pointed out, there are a lot of dotted line relationships and aligning with clinical leadership, but there's really not a team of folks under that CMIO title that's there, the office of the CMIO. And you also touched on the other key piece. Workflow here is the key word that comes into their accountability. And so the realization after these EMRs were deployed was, gosh, this is hard. It's affecting productivity. It's affecting happiness. There is more to be done to optimize this new tool. And this really starts to unpack the very nature of a knowledge worker. And that is that with new tools, you do have to understand the processes that go on behind it, the cognitive flow of information. And I think that's where the CMIO or the informatics leader here really added value. And this is right at that precipice of becoming an individual leader without a team to a true leader as healthcare organizations view it.
Mm-hmm. That's very fair. The one thing I will say, and I want to see if you agree with me, 1.0 and 2.0, the amount of change was still relatively incremental given today's level of change and uncertainty that so many organizations are going through. And when we jump into 3.0, we're going to see that it just takes a very different urgency need for strategic change, leadership, need for new ways of thinking, and probably more than one informatics leader. When we start moving into some of the activities that we're about to talk about, moving from the systems of insight world in 2.0 to 3.0, I view that it's a very different pivot. And we'll talk a little bit further about some of the challenges organizations are having going between 2.0 and 3.0.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a fair comment. And I'll tell you, during the 2.0 world, with the High Tech Act and trying to get our meaningful use dollars, it felt at the time like a big change. It was all we knew. Yet to look at where we are today, we have an exponential amount of change we need to go through, and yet the financial pressures are even more so. And what that does is squeezes out your wiggle room for failure.
Mm-hmm.
That
Mm-hmm.
pivot from being someone who optimizes a tool into being able to wrap your arms and your brain around the bigger systems and the true health system leader that CMIO 3.0 has become, really, in my mind, is that huge inflection point of the role and the evolution of this role.
Well, and you see some people making change by, creating a CHIO, or Chief Health Informatics Officer. I actually think it was about 10 years ago I did a white paper on this new role that was just kind of happening in it. And it was where you saw informatics and analytics and several other change leadership roles being kind of bundled up under this strategic executive, who often sat on par with the CMO or the chief integration or chief clinical officer. You began to see more things happening outside the enterprise, working on the care delivery network. Some of those are employees, some of those are affiliates, and some of those are competitors, where you're both in a value-based care contract and you're having to share patients and share information and share referrals. So a lot of going beyond just what one organization can do alone and what one individual or one leader can contribute to. We also began at this point, Mark, and I'd like your take on this, to see informatics teams, and they could be organized by geography. So with some of these large health systems that consolidated, they would have an informatics team in region 1 and one in region 2, and they had multiple functions. Sometimes they'd break it out by service line. So you'd have the people working with cardiology or orthopedics or whatever. Sometimes they'd break it out by inpatient or ambulatory. So we saw a little more creativity in terms of the responsibilities, the accountabilities. But I think the big shift here is, rather than having these hierarchical reporting relationships, 3.0 organizations are a lot more collaborative, and they partner, and it's less important to have the dotted lines or the matrices. It's more about the work that you're accomplishing together. I mean, give me your reaction to that.
Yeah, spot on with that. So you talked a little bit about the CHIO versus the CMIO, and I think different titles and different structures worked well for different organizations. But I think what it comes down to is whether it's your CMIO who grows into the CHIO, or how that's divided out. You've got several aspects at play that need to be under one umbrella in a collaborative form. And that's the clinical aspect, right? And the healthcare operations aspect, with some understanding of the technology. And those three are really what come together at an enterprise level to make a 3.0 organization, a 3.0, and same for a CMIO or a health informatics piece. And really, Pam, I think those three elements together, and I suppose you could weave in that fourth financial component, but I think that pressure really is now 4.0-ish as we talk about value-based care and some other things, but certainly does fit here. I think those 4, if you'd like, competencies are absolutely critical, not only to the structural role, but as also you mentioned, to the function of creating value within the organization. And I think that's a key piece to call out between 2.0 and 3.0, since some are stuck in the former. And that is the 2.0 still has this comfort in the silo of optimizing the EHR, optimizing that sort of workflow piece there. To be able to expand that into the 3.0 world, you really need to be thinking about the health system and the community, quite frankly, as a whole. And I think that's an important step in the evolution and in the maturity of the leader and in the accountability.
Well, and we talked about 1.0 being systems of record, 2.0 being systems of insight. That's where you bring in the analytics. And this is really systems of engagement. How do we use digital health tools to engage our patients and their families? We talk a lot about whole person care and having data assets that cross the continuum and cross all the sites of care. And you can't really engage with a consumer or a patient around all of their needs if you're still doing it in a siloed or functional manner.
Absolutely. And you mentioned this when we were talking about 2.0, but it's worth bringing up again, as you just did, and that is the analytic component to this, right? There's a lot that goes on within the EHR. Some companies have analytics that show how well you're performing and where opportunities are. But along with the evolution of the CMIO role in the things that we talked about, the technology and the cultural aspect and the cognitive aspect and the clinical and the operational pieces, all of those, also what goes along with that is a maturation in the analytic capabilities, not just reporting, but understanding the wealth of information. And in this 3.0, Pam, I think there's a room for the term ecosystem to start to slip in here.
I
Obviously,
agree.
becoming more prominent at 4.0, but that's another step that's probably worth calling out in the maturation of all of this going together, and that is definitely including the analytic piece. Because as we'll talk about, I'm sure we'll get to this at this stage in 2025, you can't have a conversation without mentioning AI at some point. That data, those analytics are the foundation of what you base your AI on. So if anyone hopes to leverage AI, which I'm sure we'll get to, moving from 2.0 to 3.0 is absolutely necessary. Not sufficient, but necessary to make that transition.
And, another big piece of this that I don't think enough CMIOs or health informatics leaders have been involved in is the whole interoperability play. How do you design these networks so that the data is going to the right individual or the right team at the right time, and you're supporting the decisions and ultimately creating value? And interoperability often has been a technology question as opposed to how are we working, and how are we sharing information for what purpose?
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And as you mentioned, I think it's always been a technical discussion. And I'd probably flip that a little bit and say it's a cognitive discussion. And the cognitive discussion really revolves around what information do you need when, so that you have the most complete picture you can get to do X. Whether X is a clinical decision, an operational decision, a health plan decision, a benefit decision, there's an incredible amount of cognitive science and thought flow as opposed to workflow that really the health informatics leader, we cut our teeth on this from the very beginning. And I think there's a great untapped opportunity to step forward and be that leader, to integrate that cognitive piece for much more than just the clinical aspect of what we use data analytics, the EMR and other systems in healthcare to achieve our values.
Right. Well, let's look at 4.0, and then I want to go back, examine that pivot from 2 to 3 a little bit more and figure out why people are stuck. So 4.0 is where we hear about smart health and care. This is truly systems of innovation. And this is where that care ecosystem that you just mentioned comes in and is so important. And in this role, informatics is working not just within the enterprise, but with partners across the entire community. And that could be anything from, your CBOs, your community-based organizations that are help working on the social determinants or social drivers of health. It can be looking at how do we roll out new ways of working, new care delivery models, hospital at home, virtual care, these command centers that are taking over a lot of or consolidating a lot of the work of health systems. And we're solving a lot of the same problems, but also creating value in new and different ways. And this certainly is where AI is going to have a huge role. And you and I did a webinar about a year ago where we looked at the foundation that was needed to build AI. Don't just jump into AI if you've not put forth a solid analytics foundation. But now, I mean, at that time, we thought things were moving fast. Now they're just, the accelerator has been pushed. It's happening.
Right, right. But I think that's well said. What is intriguing about this 4.0 is the continued use of the term informatics. And I think as an informatics leader, I'm going to ask for a little license to say this. I think we potentially have done a little bit of self-harm here, because informatics, I think, creates a mindset of you're focused on the EMR. And at 3.0, we should have said yes and becomes organizational value. The and becomes healthcare operations. The and becomes analytics. And
Right.
whatever all of those ands are, I think becomes that key piece that collaborates across not only the health and care ecosystem, but the wellness ecosystem. And I think now you have a wealth of data, and relying on what we've learned as informaticists in the true sense, the technical, the cultural, the cognitive piece that we've been through before. This is where we should be stepping forward and kind of elbowing folks to get at the table. And I think we can probably do as a group a better job of that. But I would ask a rhetorical question. If you look at how the informatics leader has gone from meaningful use to the 2.0 to the 3.0, now in the 4.0 world, who better to be at the table in such a time as this as that seasoned group who's been there and done a lot of very similar work. And with that lens, my goodness, there's a great opportunity to provide feedback on new business and new revenue opportunities and innovation, to really understand from actual lessons learned what can help us make some mistakes that aren't exactly like ones in the EMR days of 1.0 and 2.0, but somewhat similar.
Well, and I know it took a while, probably not 10 years, but maybe 5 or 7, to get organizations to recognize that they needed to do that optimization work. There was a lot of, well, we got them using it. Isn't that enough? Well, no, we got to make it better and make it work. And I think we don't need to wait as long this time. We need to have bigger impact in a more agile and urgent fashion, because the dynamic of the whole economy and the environment has changed so much. I mean, is that fair?
Oh, absolutely. The financial margin for error is razor thin. Absolutely razor thin everywhere coming out of COVID and trying to figure out our footing going forward. All of the other financial pressures that are out there. We need to learn very well from the experience we've been through over the past 15, 20 years since high tech.
So what I'd like to do is do a kind of rapid fire session with you. And I'm going to talk about what keeps organizations stuck at 2.0. And I want you in your mind to talk about, I'm just going to throw something out. And if you could talk about from your perspective, what causes us to be stuck with that? Why are we uncomfortable shifting? And any just quick things, just rapidly, things that you think the organizations or leaders should be focused on as opposed to what's keeping them stuck. So the very first one is over reliance on retrospective scorecards and dashboards, these static things.
Yeah. So heavily in the 2.0 world when the new EMRs actually brought together several different platforms of data and analytics so you can look at that, how you did. And I think as clinicians, we need to step forward and say, as much as it's important to know how we did, the critical questions are then, why did we do that? And how can we be better? And I think that's a mindset. And sometimes we get wowed and awed by the pretty graphics that are there and it's cool to look at these numbers. And at the end of the day, Pam, we can't just say, hey, cool numbers. Oh, wow, that's interesting. It's how does it create value? And isn't that really the essence of 3.0, that transition to value? And I think that's the critical piece where folks get stuck. Looking at a report card doesn't necessarily create value. Sometimes that's the cost of entry into the game. The real question is, how are you different? How do you differentiate yourself to create value? And I think that's why analytics can't be just a traditional IT function. And
Mhm.
I firmly believe that there needs to be someone clinical, hate to sound self-serving, but someone clinical and or operational who's heavily involved in IT leadership to know that a good analytic artifact will prompt 6 to 7 next questions to get at a root cause. What can we do better? Or how can we know this sooner in the future?
So you're describing a process of using the insights versus just a static report card.
Correct.
That's a real shift, cultural shift, if you ask me. So here's another one that I think keeps us stuck at 2.0. Our siloed roles and our fragmented ownership of different pieces and decisions.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. We can unpack that for another hour, right? Yeah. So every organization has a culture, collaboration, more ownership is more better, those sorts of things. I think that is a true cultural piece, Pam. And I think what keeps us stuck there. And I've been blessed to be in an organization where this isn't as much of a problem as I think it's some others, is when you have alignment with leadership of where you're going, of what's important to you. If you ask 20 leaders what's value in your organization and you get a very similar answer, I think that helps overcome some of the issues with siloed functionality, because if you're rowing in the same direction, I think there's a prioritization implication there that goes unspoken but is shared in a leadership team. And candidly, I think that siloed piece keeps folks in 2.0 because it's an alligator left, alligator right with all the different pressures. And sometimes I think organizations would do well to take a breath, get a meeting of the minds and a melding of the minds to get agreement top to bottom this year, this quarter, this whatever. This is what we're going to focus on because you can't do everything. And I think sometimes we get frayed by that splay. So I think alignment and that cultural piece is really the key to overcoming some of the issues with siloed ownership of some of these key pieces.
And this is kind of a cultural piece too, but there is definitely a resistance to disruptive innovation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, we spoke of it already, right? Because when you look at some of the analytic artifacts, you think, okay, so you're doing high level math, this needs to be an IT function. Well, does it? who else needs to be there to push the thinking of the folks who create artifacts? It's not, here are your numbers. It's, what are we trying to achieve with these numbers? Where are we going with them?
And then final one um, is incentives that reward the status quo.
My goodness. So where do we begin, right? Everything
Yes.
from payment models to organizational, cultural pieces that are there. You're right. The disruptive innovators are sort of out in front, tip of the spear, on the plank, not sure if that's a saw in the background or applause in the background, or what's happening. And and it does make you wonder where all this is going. And at the same time, what I would throw out is, for an informatics clinician, this is really our time, right? This is our time to step forward, as I've said before, to kind of elbow our way to the table and be disruptive and be innovators. This is our opportunity to be heard. And I think if we don't seize it, we will not be heard. We will not have the opportunity to be heard. And I believe the overall decision process will lose out on incredibly valuable insight from where we've been in this little clinical health informatics journey over the last 15, 20 years.
Well, let's dig in for just a minute to analytics, since that's such a big part of your role. This is something you and I've talked about a good bit historically, that there are different types of analysis that can be done. And, there's the descriptive analysis that is more your traditional decision support. And a lot of organizations that are new to analytics are kind of still focused on that. And, they're looking at things like what happened. They're, teasing apart the how many, how often, where, who, et cetera. How did we perform? Really understanding the problem. And then they move a little bit more broadly into diagnostic, but both diagnostic and descriptive analytics is looking backwards. That's looking at what we've done. And that's where you see a lot of your static reporting, your static dashboards, with some movement if you're doing some forecasting. But if you really think about it, you could almost say that 2.0 is descriptive and diagnostic, and 3.0 and 4.0 are where you move into the predictive and prescriptive. Give your take on this and how that ties to the pivot that organizations have to make to really move into 3.0 in a strong way, and not just doing the traditional static reporting and dashboards, et cetera.
So potentially, unfortunately, this is beyond critical, right? So when you look at the descriptive and diagnostic analytics, that is really just basic reporting. And to score keep, healthcare is beyond that. Right.
Yes.
We can't be satisfied with, here's a scorecard. This is how we did. Things are moving quickly. Technologies are moving quickly. Payment models are moving, probably not quick enough, but quickly as well. So really, that creation of value and the concept of innovation is the 2.0 to 3.0 transformational ideation. And I think you see that exactly mirrored in the analytic model, going from the diagnostic to predictive and descriptive. What compounds the need to push forward with this, and I'll talk about pushing forward in a minute. The foundational piece to be able to do the more advanced types of analytics is data and confidence in your data assets. And at the same time, that same discipline is what's going to enable your organization to leverage AI. And I think we can all agree that at some level, AI is critical for success in the future of an organization in terms of efficiency, how and where, and is it patient facing and all those other things, and how will it be regulated? Those are all to be determined. At the same time, the the elephant is in the room. Without a solid data foundation, don't think about AI. And as you look at the journey to get there, how do you get there? And it's going beyond those diagnostic analytics to predictive and prescriptive analytics. And candidly, the mindset of the leader to create value in that journey is important. At the same time, your IT organization likely gets a reporting package. And so how do you push them from static reporting to some of these advanced analytics? And what's worked at our organization is we've actually brought people in from outside of healthcare to push the thinking, the true technical folks, and have taken the time to say, you're going to learn an entirely new vocabulary, a new ecosystem, a new payment system, but we need your technical piece that will augment with the clinical piece, the hospital operations piece, and the reimbursement piece to push the whole organization forward. And I think it's scary in some aspects when you're an IT organization without a heavy clinical presence. To take that on must be incredibly frightening, because the question is, who among us can lead this new technical person to these other disciplines to make it all make sense?
Well, and I don't know if you agree with me on this, but I kind of believe ultimately AI may be the answer to our challenges of the last 20 plus years in healthcare. That so much of the cost has been us throwing bodies and labor at issues. You know, if this system doesn't talk to this one, then we've got somebody pulling it down and analyzing it and taking it over, or we've got nurses calling and interacting with the patient when the systems don't do that. Or I mean, I think a lot of the routine work that our healthcare organizations do today, we can solve. But I see organizations literally today that are so risk averse. They're like, oh, that AI can cause trouble, we're not doing it. And of course, it's got to be managed, it's got to be evaluated. But let me run a few 3.0 thinking phrases by you and get your reaction, and tell us how that's different in many, no, I'm not saying Parkview, but in many organizations today who are still kind of stuck in that 2.0 world. But one is that data should guide real-time action. How is that being done or not being done by a lot of organizations?
Yeah, I think that gets back to what we talked about just a moment ago. When you look at retrospective reporting and you look at traditional IT competencies, you get this EMR package and you've got a reporting system, a reporting package, and we're all excited because now it's unified. We don't have 12 different systems, and sure, that's great. And we're happy with it, but telling me the first quarter score at halftime really doesn't do a lot. And I think a lot of that in my mind is for regulatory reporting, and the real value creation has to go to near real time reporting of almost everything,
Yeah.
right? You can't wait till the end of the year to know that you missed an opportunity with sepsis bundle compliance. You can't go into a payer negotiation with them telling you what all your numbers are without validating. It's just not conducive to retrospective analysis to keep pace and keep your head above water, given all the financial and operational and efficiency pressures we're under. You just have to push towards real-time reporting, and even real-time projections of the next 60 days, 30 days, quarter, year, to know where you should be spending your cycles. Because Pam, as you mentioned, we can't keep throwing bodies and humans to solve some of these issues with healthcare efficiency and costs.
Well, here's another good one for 3.0. Success is the patient and their families being activated in response to their own care. They are working to coordinate with their care team, and they understand that outcomes do matter.
Absolutely critical. Again, it just keeps coming up left and right and left again. And that's the 2.0 to 3.0 is focused on value, value. And at the same time, what's implied in that comment is analytics or data or knowledge or commentary appropriate for many different levels on an education or a medical knowledge platform to be able to successfully engage. And what that requires, again, to bring the E word ecosystem back into that 3.0, 4.0 conversation, these need to be connected. It needs to be a single ecosystem so that we are aligned. And I, gave my opinion about organizational leadership alignment in the past, and not only for the healthcare system operations, but also for patient care. You need
Mm-hmm.
to have alignment from payers to patients to providers. And, candidly, just getting providers and patients on the same page obviously leads to better outcomes. But these are the systems that need to be doing that. And as we look at going from 3.0 to 4.0, we need to be more innovative and creative with the ways we manage that. Because as you mentioned, we can't keep hiring nurse navigators and care coordinators to do all this for us. And so, Pam, this I hope highlights how being stuck in 2.0 is essentially drilling another hole in the hull of your boat, hoping that you'll stay afloat longer. You just can't do it. You have to push forward.
Well, and that really brings up this next one for me. It is the fact that we need to redesign for what's possible, not for what has been.
Very well said. Very well said. And I think that's frightening for healthcare that is traditionally understood as change averse
Mm-hmm.
and slow to adopt new technologies. And forgive me if it does sound self-serving, but this comment once again highlights where the clinical HIT leader needs to step forward because we've been there, right? We've been part of systems that change how we record information, how we get information, how we make decisions. We've been part of that change management process, and it's not always been easy. But what we've gone through in our careers over the past decade, decade and a half is valuable for the future, for those that haven't. And I think it's the clinical informatics or informatician, who else has been down that road? And this is the exact preparation we need for such a time as this.
One of the things too, this will be my last one just to get your reaction to, but we've never been accused in this industry of moving fast, moving with lightning speed, being aggressive. We have a very top down hierarchical decision making process. You got to get everybody's consensus. If we're really going to drive 3.0 and 4.0, we're going to have to become more agile. And what do you see happening out there? Are people just kind of getting stuck and slowing down, or are you seeing some examples of people maybe using what they learned in COVID to be a little more agile and make in more forward thinking decisions?
Yeah, so I think we're seeing far too little of that, Pam. And when you look at it from a clinical leadership perspective, you really don't want to be wrong. You want to play the odds. You worry about a patient outcome. At the same time, we're at this critical point of healthcare where
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe you have to be right all the time, but you have to have the methodologies in place for rapid self-assessment to course correct quickly. And I think that that mindset is what's going to separate the haves from the have-nots in the future. And I think the traditional folks that you look at as innovative have that sort of bred into their DNA of leadership. That needs to get to the majority quickly, very quickly, because things change so quickly. To wait until the dust settles, it won't settle.
Right.
Be comfortable in a dust storm, and sitting still, doing nothing is doing something. It's watching everybody else go past. and the way reimbursement and value-based care and some of the bonuses and payments and the opportunities to succeed are, as you watch more and more people go by you, you sort of put your organization at a disadvantage. So I think the key piece in the DNA is to be innovative in your thinking, quick to move, but even more quick to course correct. The only way you're going to do that is if you've got a good foundation to see around you in terms of what your changes are affecting. And again, we're back to that 2.0 to 3.0 piece in terms of analytics and system thinking to be able to really understand that.
Yeah, and be willing to take a few risks, but analyze the risk as you go and adapt and refine. So in the past, you have talked or shared with me, you have three components that are critical in terms of success, and you've described them to me as technical, cultural, and cognitive. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means and how that fits into all this that we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So for other work that we've done together in kind of summarizing the journey of the clinical informatician. So when you look at those three disciplines, and at one point we were talking about those are the foundational disciplines to prepare your organization for AI, because it's another inflection point of healthcare, right? So if you look at what we've been through, we as clinical informaticians have understood from a technical standpoint what an EMR does, how data gets in, how data is processed, artifact creation to put data out. And implied in that is all sorts of issues around data governance, accuracy, bias, availability, gold standard validation methods. That technical piece has been part of the informatician for a long time. The cultural piece that we've been through really revolves around the way decisions are made in an organization. And we've talked before that healthcare is typically a consensus decision-making organization, and putting an EMR in with decision support, with data gathering sort of changes that. And when you add that cultural value creation piece on top, it's been the informatician who's had to connect those dots for the organization. Here's the data. It's governed. This is how we get the data. Here are the strengths and weaknesses of the data, but here's how it creates value. The cultural piece of that shared domain knowledge has really been on the shoulders of the informatician. For the cognitive piece in what we've been through, as we look at the EHR journey, for a knowledge worker like a clinician, no matter what kind of clinician, new technology has to map to the way we think and process information to do our knowledge work. And that piece is probably why you couldn't just throw an EMR in and expect exponential gains in efficiencies and patient care and outcomes. And that cognitive piece, it's about user interface. It's about where in the workflow is that data presented and the learnability of that new UI. Those three elements, technical, cultural, and cognitive that I just described, isn't that really what's coming forward with AI? Completely changing the technology, how decisions are made, and how does that AI map to the way that we traditionally make healthcare decisions, and what's our comfort level with it? It just feels like the past really is and should be helping us for this future that seems to be knocking on our doorstep.
So I'm sure you've heard the recent quote by Bill Gates about saying AI is going to replace the need for physicians altogether. I'd like your take on that quote, please.
Yeah, so I don't agree with that.
I figured.
Yeah, I think it can augment physicians and what we do in caregiving. And I think one of the things we learned from COVID is that we are a social construct. We are connected. The human being is more than disease or wellness. There's an empathetic piece that because we weren't able to be in proximity and touch and feel and be close, that we suffered from. And I think that learning is probably the biggest one to walk away with from the COVID experience. And I would hope that we learn from that so that we aren't replaced by AI. And that piece of AI augmenting healthcare also carries risk with it
Mm-hmm.
because you worry about what skills that are truly healthcare related as opposed to the emotional and empathetic will go away as the bias of relying on AI takes over. So it's a double-edged sword. I don't think, I hope it won't replace physicians. If it does, then we become solely reliant on it. And I think that's full of risk too
Mm-hmm.
because of everything we've talked about, data quality, learning, analytics, and some of the foundational pieces that really I don't think the entirety of the US healthcare system has a great grasp on.
Yes, and we still need that that empathy and that compassionate and that human side of taking care of patients that hopefully AI is not quite ready to do that part yet. But so what will it take for an organization to successfully lead 3.0 and 4.0? I know there are a number of health systems that are still kind of in that, you know, that 2.0 incremental optimization world that maybe even questioning why do we need health informatics leaders now? But to do the things you're talking about, it's a very different construct. And I hear things like you need the right org structure, you need a good governance structure, there's so many pieces that take it beyond that incremental world. And from your perspective, if you could only have three things that would really support you in doing that type of work, what would those three things be?
Yeah, so I think one piece that's critical is the development of the clinical IT leader. And it can be a physician, it can be a PA, an NP, a nurse, and it should be all of them, therapists as well. I think there needs to be a commitment at every organization that there is something to be gained from someone with knowledge of the patient experience, the provider experience, and healthcare operations as we make these decisions going forward. I think that's point number one. I think to be successful, there needs to be, as we've talked about before, and hate to repeat myself, but I would say definitely an innovative mindset of moving quickly, and it's okay to take a misstep as long as you can quickly course correct. I think sitting on the sidelines and hoping it doesn't affect you or playing ostrich, that would be the second piece that I think would be absolutely critical. The third, I think we probably need to be thinking as much about the healthcare worker as we do the patient. And I know we do a lot with technology and we talk about people, process, and technology. And I know that a lot of organizations struggle with the workforce and what it means to them. I think there's an opportunity for a renewed focus on the workforce. There's a lot of anxiety with economic pressures. Is AI going to replace my job? And satisfaction and burnout and things along those lines. I think the first 2 points of clinical leadership and innovation and quick course correct need to be viewed at a mindset of how do we keep the healthcare workforce whole and doing better so that overall they're contributing as best they can while they're on the time clock and really understand and can feed those leaders, those developed clinical leaders, ideas and innovation and pushing forward. And I think those are the things that potentially could help us out along the road.
So, in my last webinar, I did a session on 10x value, and we had to go beyond just kind of that incremental change and kind of that lean Six Sigma mentality to something that was more robust and braver, if you will. And one of the points I really brought up, and I want your take on this, is the EHR is kind of the elephant in the room. If you look at the money that the average health system, whether you're small or large, and it's, I'll just say gazillions of dollars. I mean, it's huge.
Yep.
And this investment that people have poured into these systems, I ask you what you really believe the role of the EHR is in 3.0 and 4.0, and should we be looking at it with a different lens or a different perspective than we have historically?
So at the risk of going out on a limb and being incredibly controversial, let's just go there.
Okay.
So, so I think you have to be open to the idea that in the future, the front end to every EMR might be AI,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so the question is, how many times should you be logging into your EHR on a daily basis? And if your answer is, well, we have tap badges, you're still waiting for the login to process, right? So should that be part of the experience? And so if you take that metaphor and understand the potential futures that you want to keep in mind, one of those might be that the role of the EHR is sort of a database plus.
Mm.
And I think that is tough for all of us to swallow, given the gazillion plus dollars that we've put into it. And at the same time, we all needed to get electronic so that we could understand on some sort of level playing ground. And I get it. We need help with data standards and you aren't really comparing app. I understand all that. But
Right.
at some level to be able to ask questions like, how are we doing? How could we be better? Where should we be better in the future? Right.
Right.
I think we all needed to get to the EHR point. But I think at some point, Pam, when your model goes to 5.0, I'm not sure that
Think it will one day.
well, maybe,
We added
maybe.
4.0 in the last 18 months.
Yeah, understood. So, I think that's it's an interesting question, especially for EHR vendors. And I think what you'll probably see is they'll want to be in on the AI game and try and become sort of jacks of all trades, maybe understanding that future of the UI that sort of differentiates them and maps to all the cognition we've talked about might go away with our ambient AI friends listening in. And I think that changes things and it asks and begs a really important question. And that is who will fund and how will we fund that transformation? And I certainly don't have the answer to that. I wish I did, but that's an incredibly challenging question that I think we need to ask ourselves at some point if that's a potential future.
Well, and I've said for years, and I think you would agree with this, that one organization, one enterprise cannot do it all. We have to work together. And the challenges of this industry are so great. We're going to need more partnerships, more community driven initiatives. It can't always just be this enterprise versus this enterprise.
Yeah. Yeah. Understood.
So I always ask my guest one question as we conclude. And the question for you today, Mark, is what have we not talked about that we should have talked about in this very interesting conversation?
So I think the one piece that I'd love for you to tackle on a different episode would be getting down into the nuts and bolts of how does a leader build out an analytics organization. And I think we touched on it, but we didn't unpack it. And I think
Okay.
that piece is foundational to being able to course correct quickly, to building your AI capabilities. And I think it's really foundational for an organization to be successful in 3.0 and 4.0. So a little more drilling down on that would probably be the one thing that I think would be of value.
Okay, that's really helpful because we get questions all the time. Should it be centralized? Should it be decentralized? And often it's some kind of hybrid that works best for most organizations. It's not either or, but digging in, how do you build it? How do you stage it? All of that would
Yeah.
probably be really helpful. So thanks for
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. How do you govern it? That other piece is that piece too.
Well, you and I could do a whole additional session on governance, so that would be interesting. Well, thanks so much for your time today, and I hope to see you soon.
Sounds good. Enjoyed the time, Pam. Thank you.
All right, thanks.